Hi, and welcome to another video in this series that I'm doing on using Sonic Pi version 3.2.1 on Raspberry Pi. I've got a 4B here with 4 GB of memory, but it will work on other Raspberry Pi, either the 2 gig version of a Pi 4 or a 3B Plus or a 3, and even probably just on a 2, although very sluggishly there. Yesterday I produced a video on using MIDI with this setup, as this is one of the new features brought by 3.2.1, because the current version of 3.1 for Sonic Pi doesn't enable MIDI to work. I realized after I'd made the MIDI that I'd actually made a slight boob in running one of the programs, in that I had a previous program running at the same time, so it was quite hard to hear Qsynth actually working properly. And I thought it would also be useful to illustrate how to set up Qsynth from scratch to work with this. In order to do this, you need to use QJackctl, this program up here, and this is on Sonic Pi, on the Raspberry Pi Buster distribution when it comes, but it's hidden. When you go down to the main menu, it's actually in the sound and video section. I've got a few other things added here, but here is the program here, QJackctl. And the way you get it to work is you go to the preference menu and you go to main menu editor, and that will bring up a screen, hopefully. And if you click on the sound and video section on the list on the left-hand side, you could see a list of the items in that menu, and when it comes you'll find there won't be all these here, but you'll find that the entry for QJackctl is actually dimmed out like that. All you have to do is to come here, tick it, and then say OK, and it will then be active in the menu. Now the reason for using this is that although Sonic Pi doesn't need it to connect, it gives you some extra flexibility, both in the setting up any sound card that you may have added to your Pi. And for this purpose I'm actually using an extra external sound card, and I would strongly advise you thinking of investing in one. It can just be a cheap dongle USB device, the sort that you might pick up from Amazon for about under a tenner, I think they are now. And this would normally come with a stereo output 3.5mm socket and a mono input signal. And the important thing about it is that it gives a much better performance than the built-in sound card in Sonic Pi, in that you can drive it with a faster response time and as a lower latency. This is particularly important if you're trying to play a keyboard into Sonic Pi and keep up with it, because otherwise you find that you play the keyboard and you hear the sound quite a bit later, and it becomes very hard to play. What I'm about to do will work with just the internal card, but it will be better if you use the external one. Now the reason I'm using this is so that we can set this up to run with QJackctl. I've actually already started it, because the other thing that I'm running, and the other reason I need to use it, is that I'm using a screen recorder. This is the little icon here, and you can see if I bring up this card here, you could see the preview of what it's actually doing here. Actually, yes, it is recording. I did start it recording. You can, in order for this to work, you need to set it up using QJackctl. Now, this is the main screen for QJackctl, and you can see that it's started. There is a setup screen here, and I just want to say a little bit about that and how it actually works. If I click on it, you will get a series of different tabs on the top. The only one you really need to concern yourself with is the settings one, and that has two screens down here, the parameters screen and the advanced screen. On the parameters screen you should have real-time ticked, ALSA set there, and then this appertains to the particular interface that you're running. Normally when you get Sonic Pi, it will be set up to run with a sample rate of 48,000, and that's probably what you'll find that your external dongle interface will run at. I'm using a slightly better one at the moment, which will actually run a bit faster, and I've got the sample rate run at 96,000 in this case. And you can see that the other two things here are the number of frames per period, which I've set to 256, but that will normally be 1024 on the default setting when you start this up, and the number of periods per buffer, which will be 2. That's probably a pretty good one to aim for. And you can see that if I change these, if I change that from 256 to 512, it's actually going to increase what we call the latency. In other words, that is the delay between playing a note and you hearing the sound of it, 10.7 milliseconds. If we were to set this to the settings that you normally have with the inbuilt card, I think it's something round about that, and you get a latency of about 42.7 milliseconds, and that really becomes quite appreciable and noticeable. So I'm going to set this back to the settings I've got for this particular card, which is 96,000, and I think I had it set to 512, was it? Or even you could have probably to pinch get down to 256, but just to be safe, we'll leave it at 512, and that's a reasonably respectable latency of 10.7 milliseconds. Now, if we go on to the Advanced tab, then you don't need to touch anything over here at all. The only things you want to look at are the settings for the output device and the input device. If you're not using QJackctl and you are just running Sonic Pi directly, you can actually select the card that you want to use up here by right-clicking on the icon here, and you can choose which one you want to use, and that will actually work without starting up QJackctl, but it will use the built-in settings in Sonic Pi which have the slightly worse latency on them. But for most people, when you start off, you will probably have this set either to analog or HDMI, depending upon where you want to hear your sound, and Sonic Pi will adjust appropriately. You need to do this before you start running Sonic Pi. You can't change it after you've got it running. It'll change things, but it won't change what Sonic Pi is, where Sonic Pi is sending its sound to. So I've actually got the Eddie Roll device connected here, and so we'll leave that set on that particular setting at the moment. Right, so how do we find that? Well, if we start with the output device, you get a list of all the devices that hardware devices that are on the machine which can be recognized. Don't worry about the loopback one. That's another one which I've added, which will not normally be on your machine. What you will probably have is the one which is HWALSA with HWALSA 0 and HWALSA 1 there, and HWALSA 2. These are to do with the internal sound card. Here is the external one which I've got, the UA25 Eddie Roll UA25, and the rule of thumb is that you take the setting for the card you're using which doesn't have a .0 at the end of it, and you set that as the output device, and you take in the input one the corresponding card number which has got a 0 after it and set that there. So if we were going to use the internal card, it's probably better just to use that with the up here and not bother with that. But that's what I want for my external card there. And then we say OK. We have actually changed something. I think I don't actually want to change whatever the setting was at the moment. I think it was the same one, because I've got Jack running there. I probably had, let's just see if we go to setup and I change this. I suspect what it was is that I had this set to 256 down here with a 5.3 millisecond latency. No, it wasn't that. So I've changed the setup, which will come into play next time I start it, but as long as I don't stop this, because if I stop it then Sonic Pi will just need restarting again, it will continue using the settings which are currently set. So let's go to the Connect box here, and you can see the settings we've got at the moment. here is Super Collider output. That's the output from Sonic Pi, and that is being fed into the system output, which is the Eddie-Roll output device, which is my phones are connected to. It is also being sent to the simple screen recorder, which is doing this audio recording, so you'll be able to hear it on the recording. The only other connection is the connection between the system input, that is the input from the Eddie-Roll. It's got two inputs, but I'm only using a mono microphone, which is on capture 1, and I've connected that to both of the input ports, a simple recorder. You'll notice that we can have more than one thing connected there, and it's quite happy with that. So we've got the audio from Sonic Pi, and we've got the microphone coming in as well. The other connection on here will let us set up some MIDI connections. At the moment, I've got 2 ports available. One is a MIDI through port, which is built into the system. Those of you who are eagle-eyed will have noticed I had MIDI through port 0 and MIDI through port 1 yesterday. I've removed port 1, which is not normally present, and perhaps in a later video I'll show you how to put it there if you need more of them. But normally you just have 1, and we've got the USB keyboard there. The reason it's on both sides is that you can both send information to it and from it, but we're normally just using it to send information into an external synth or into Sonic Pi. So at any rate, the purpose of this video is to show you using Qsynth. So let's come up here and go down to sound and video and start it running. There it is. We'll just click on it and that should start it running. There it's going, and you could see the icon for it there. And if you looked at the video yesterday, you can see the synth settings which are associated with each channel of the MIDI channels 1 to 16. We are only going to use channel 1 here, so that's the only one that we're interested in, which at the moment is set to a Yamaha grand piano. Now, when we did that, it will have added some extra possibilities for connections in QJackctl. Let's go to, first of all here, and you can see that there's a new MIDI connection which is for the Fluid Synth, which is the synthesizer built into Qsynth. And what we want to do is to allow Sonic Pi to drive this. So we're going to drive it using MIDI through port. So we're going to connect that to here like that. Oops. Let's just do it this way. Click on both those and then click on connect, and that's that connected. We'll leave the keyboard disconnected for the moment and we'll come back to that in a minute. Let's go back to the audio side now, and you can see that we've got Qsynth with an output. That's the audio it's producing, and it's automatically connected itself to the system. Now, in fact, I want it to go into Sonic Pi instead of the system. And so I'm going to disconnect those 2 connections, and the easiest way to do that is if we collapse that again, click on Qsynth, click on system, and the 2 things which are highlighted there, if I click on disconnect, not disconnect all, disconnect, it'll disconnect those 2. And if I now change that to Super Collider there, and we connect those 2 up by saying connect, then we've got the output from Qsynth going to the input terminal, input ports of Super Collider, and we're going to allow those to come into Super Collider using the live audio connection, which we'll see in the program in a minute. So that's set up then for us to do some simple work with Qsynth. Remember, the input to Qsynth is a MIDI input, and that's coming from MIDI input port through port 0, going to drive the Fluid Synth. The output from it is going from Qsynth to Super Collider, in other words to Sonic Pi. The output of Sonic Pi, which is here, is going to the audio output in my Eddie-Roll UA25 interface, into which my headphones are connected so that I can hear it. It's also going to Simple Recorder so that you can hear it on the audio of the video which is being made. So let's for the moment come back to Sonic Pi, and I'm going to switch to a program which is the same one that we used yesterday. I've got one further line I put in here which is commented out at the moment. That's a stop in this bottom live loop, which we'll come back to in a minute. But just to go through what it is, first of all, I've got this set to using MIDI defaults port MIDI through port 0. That's where we're going to send MIDI signals from Sonic Pi. And if we turn on the preferences and look at the I/O settings, you can see a list of the connected MIDI output ports, and there's one, a MIDI through port 0, and that's where we're going to send the MIDI. And the MIDI system is enabled, and we've said we're going to use a middling velocity with which we hit the keys. If we do vel_f, that's a factor which simply goes from 0 to 1. If we use velocity there, it's a number that goes from 0 to 255. So it's easier perhaps to use just that factor. That's a little nice feature of Sonic Pi. And we're using channel 1 as the default. So to listen to the sound coming from Qsynth, we bring it in using this live audio. We give it a name. I've just called it Qsynth. That could be anything. I could call it :Foo or :Fred or :Robin or whatever I like. And then after a comma I said stereo true, which means it'll take the first two channels, channel 1 and channel 2, as a stereo input from there. And we've put that inside an FX call of reverberation. So it's going to give a moderate amount of reverberation with a room setting of 1/2, and it's going to take 70% of the signal for that. So you'll get a little reverb on top of that, and that will then appear in Sonic Pi. And if we turn this off again, it will also appear on the scope. You can see the signals there when we start playing. You'll remember from yesterday, if you watched the other video, that we have one live loop here which is going to change every 3.2 seconds. The reason I've chosen 3.2 is that the notes are going to last for 0.1 of a second, and so that's every 32 notes, a nice round number. And the value of n is going to go up every time we go round this loop. This uses the tick command in Sonic Pi, which is basically a number that starts from 0 the first time you get there and increments every time, and it keeps on going up and up and up. But I've used %118 after that, which means that it divides the answer by 118 and takes the remainder. So it'll go from 0 to 117 and then back to 0 again and continue going up again. And we use the MIDI program change command built into Sonic Pi, which sends the necessary commands to Qsynth to set the program number n to anything between 0 and 117. And if we bring Qsynth to the front again, and particularly the channel list, you could see that program 0, the starting one, is the Yamaha Grand Piano. That after the first change it would go to Bright Yamaha Grand, and then so on, because the first few channels have just got the first few different voices allocated to them in order. And we'll see what the others are later when we start playing. And then we get down to the bottom part, and this is a live loop called Play MIDI. It takes a scale of notes, which is this particular command will work out. That is going to give you a list of notes in the key of C minor pentatonic. That's 5 notes for each scale, starting from C2, and it's going to go 4 octaves up. And having got that list of notes, it's going to choose one of them each time it comes round here at random. So we get a random note from those 4 octave scales, and it's going to make it last for 0.1 of a second. And what that means with the MIDI command is that when the note starts, it sends a MIDI note on signal. 0.1 of a second later, it sends a MIDI note off signal and stops the note. And while that is happening, the loop waits for 0.1 seconds, because these two commands will actually happen concurrently at the same time. And then it goes back again and starts the next note. So we get a sequence of notes sounding. So all being well, if we've got everything set up correctly, when I start the program running, you should hear the notes. You should see the frequency distribution of the notes up there. You should see some MIDI cues down here. And you should see the commands showing the MIDI commands being sent out in the log here. So let's start this playing. 3, 2, 1, go. There we are. And you'll notice you can hear the sound changing every 32 notes. And just to see that visually, if we look at the channel list, at the top item here, you can see that that changes every 32 notes. Celeste playing now, and now Glockenspiel, and now a music box, and now a vibraphone, and now marimba. What I'm going to do now is to uncomment this, and we're going to run the program again, and it will stop playing. Now the reason it will stop playing is because we've stopped the live loop, which is sending the MIDI notes to play. But if we come up here and have a look, we can see that it's still actually changing every so often the synth which is being used, the time apart every 3.2 seconds. And you can see those cues going out down here, a program change command, 23, then the next one will be 24, and so on. And what I'm going to do now is to come back to the connection menu, and we're going to go to the ALSA section here, and we're going to take the USB keyboard. Now if we try and connect it on here, yeah, it's gone there. So we've got that connected in as well, and if I just play, we can hear the notes. And you notice that it's changing the synths that it's using every every 3.2 seconds. It's not every 32 notes, because I'm not playing fast enough for that. But they're synth bass. And now it's changed to synth bass too. Contrabass, it's probably too low, out of the range of thing at that height, so it's too high a note. I go down to low. So hopefully you can see from this that it's a very versatile system. We can use a keyboard to play in real time back into Sonic Pi. We can actually start this loop again, and I could attempt to copy them together, but it'd be quite hard to tell which is which when we start that playing. I'll tell you what we might do is we might have a little gap between the notes so that I can hear me playing the keyboard as well. So it'll be every 16 notes effectively that it changes what it's playing. So let's start that again. So we'll stop that. So there we are. That's taken a fairly quick look through setting up Qsynth to run with Sonic Pi. And the key to doing the connections is to use QJackctl in order to set things up. And once you've got the setup appropriate for the card which you're using, then you can start start QJackctl running. This must be running before you start Sonic Pi, because you've got to define the rates that you're using, and you've got to have got this running, which you do by clicking on the start button, and then you could start Sonic Pi and you could start Qsynth CTL, and if you were going to, you could start the screen recorder, but normally you would not have that running. And then once you've done that, don't forget that as well as setting up the connection for the audio side of it, which we do here, and in fact you don't need to have Qsynth playing through Super Collider. In fact, just to show that, let me just disconnect Qsynth from Super Collider like that, and I'm going to connect it as it will set itself up by default simply to play on the system. And hi, I've just come back to this recording because I realized in reviewing it just after I'd finished that I'd inadvertently disconnected the output of Qsynth from the recorder when I shut down Sonic Pi, and therefore you weren't able to hear anything. So I've just slightly adjusted the settings again. Sonic Pi has gone, and we've got Qsynth connected to the system, so I was hearing it all right, but what was missing was the connection from Qsynth to the simple screen recorder so that the audio will be recorded on the video. I've now put that in, and just to remind you that we've got the USB keyboard connected to the Qsynth input as well. So this is nothing to do with Sonic Pi, it's just Qsynth connected directly in to the audio system and to the screen recorder. And if I play, you can hopefully now hear what's happening. And I could just double check that, because if I go and actually look at the screen behind the screen recorder, I can see the audio going into that there, but we'll just hide that because we don't want to complicate matters too much. And the other thing is that during the video I forgot how to set the actual program which was playing on channel 1. At the moment, remember, it's the Yamaha Grand Piano. The way you do it is you simply double click on the channel you want to change. You then choose what you want, let's say tubular bells, and we say OK, and you'll see it's now changed channel 1 to say tubular bells. Let's go a bit higher. So you can see that that does actually change as well. So just a little addendum to show you how you could do that, but as you'll agree, it's slightly more tedious doing this than sending just a simple MIDI PC command from Sonic Pi with the number of the particular instrument that you want fed in there. We could do one other one, for example, if I just go to 8 there and then say OK, then, oops, I did it on the wrong one, that one there, and we go to, what do we want? What did I choose? I chose a Celeste, didn't I? Celeste on there. That's now got that running, and the end.